nice. So I'm talking, my general theme is around experimental design. And I'm sure many of you know Facebook. And occasionally I get this kind of general Facebook meme popping up from various friends and family members that love science. Because science has done some great things for us. But I might start by asking you a question, a very simple question. What does science do other than be good and advance things? What's the general premise of what does science as a thing, a scientific method attempt to do? Lovely. Well, ask questions. It makes, once you have a question, it makes a claim to answer that question. And the key phrase there is claim. And these claims, so possible answers to a question, are usually substantiated with data, evidence to support your claim. And I'm going to come back to this over and over again in different ways. But this is, if you like, the core premise of the experimental design. Experimental design is the scientific method, and a scientific method asks a question, it gathers some data to provide potential support an answer to that question. So I promised you more of an introduction about me earlier on, and I'm starting to wake up now. It's helping. So I came to HCI from experimental psychology. I did my undergraduate and PhD were both at Cardiff University in Wales, which is in the UK, and I had a funded PhD studentship, which I did for 3 years. I did that straight out of an undergraduate degree in psychology. During that 3-year PhD, I attended a number of doctoral consortiums. So these were student events, graduate student events organised at the side of conferences. So often when you have conferences, there will be a special event for PhD students. Usually about 12 students with about 2 faculty members that will be mentors at these events. So like this, but probably much smaller. And focused much more on your area, in this case it was. I also undertook 2 industrial internships, research internships at Xerox PARC, where you did everything but invent the mouse, and also at Microsoft Research in Redmond, which was great. The highlight of that was going to Bill Gates' house and hanging out with Bill. There's about 60 of us interns, and that was quite fun, standing on his garden and felt like he was with us for 2 hours. Talked to him, which was very nice. At the end of that fun summer in Redmond, I came back and wrote up my PhD thesis in 5 weeks, which was very interesting. And then submitted that, and then went off to Drexel University in Philadelphia for 2 years. Many of you might be thinking about this whole writing up business. At the end, you have to write this thesis. The best advice is start writing now. At UCL, we have many programs in place to help our students do this. So the offices varies across universities, but what processes we have in place is that at the end of the first year, students write a little thesis, and at the end of the second year, they write a slightly bigger thesis. And then when they come to the end of their 3rd year, it's not much more work, really. They've already got this kind of document, which is sizable. And it's had input from various faculty members in various ways. And so it's very achievable to do this, the 5-week thing. And it's certainly what I've seen of my students. In fact, 2 of my students, one submitted just Wednesday, in fact. He did that in about the same kind of time period, again, because there's a lot to build on. So start writing up now, make your life better. After I did my postdoc 2 years at Drexel, I joined UCL just in 2007, and I've been there for some number of years now, and I quickly am losing track. Now a senior lecturer there, And what does that entail? It entails research, teaching, and service. Basically being very busy. Just a little bit about our group. So I can certainly share this with you if you're interested. We have a UCLIC newsletter, our 2014 edition, which is a little PDF that gives a summary of all of our activities and types of work that we do there. We have some broad areas of research. It's a HCI research group, you see how it sits between computer science and psychology. So we straddle the faculties of engineering and life sciences. And we have, as you can see here, I've listed 6 big, broad areas of research that we undertake. And we're quite a sizable research group for HCI as well. HCI tends to be part of a computer science one, or part of a psychology, or part of. So we're quite a sizable research department in our own size. So we have 11 faculty, so 11 faculty members, 27 researchers, that's PhDs and postdocs. And as a result of that, we have quite good output. So this year, CHI is the major HCI venue, right? It's the big one. We had 12 full papers, and we won 5 prizes for those, which was quite nice. So just to kind of orientate you to today, so we're now heading towards lunch. So this is experiment time. So my plan is to kind of give you a little talk, like more of a lecture, to get you thinking before lunch. We'll then have some lunch, and I know then you have lunch, and then there's that kind of period after lunch. So rather than doing more talking, I'm going to set you a couple of activities to keep you moving around and thinking more in that kind of way. And then that's going to take about an hour to an hour and a half, and then in the last hour, I've got like a statistics lecture I'm going to give to you, because I think statistics and experimental design really do sit hand in hand. And I heard some of you kind of come from a psychology background, and you'll have heard a lot of this before, but I think for those that haven't come from that background, there's some important things to just high level, we're not going into the details, just high level stuff that you should be aware of. And then we'll have your group book at the end. So this morning, this is, if you like, the thrust of what I'm going to talk to you now for the next 45 minutes. Thinking about contribution, experimental method, analysis of data. An experimental method analysis is going to be wrapped up in an example to make it kind of more interesting. And then we're going to come out of that example and talk about some issues about reliability, validity, and some current themes that I see in our community. So more questions. I asked you what science was. Here's probably more of a personal question. What do you think is the criteria for awarding a PhD? I'm guessing most of you are all on that path. So, where do you hope to be in the next between 3 and a few months? What will your examiners be thinking when they read your doorstopper document?
I think you must be able to make an argument and prove that with the research that you have done. So you must
So you have to develop an argument and do some research. Yeah. Contribution. That's a good one. What's contribution? So you're building an argument, backing it up with some work, and the sum of that has to be making a contribution. And the critical question is it a novel contribution? That's often the key thing that sits in an examiner's mind. So, is the work advancing a contribution, and is their work done as well? That might be the second question. What's a contribution? World peace? Curing some cancer? Making an interface that I just think and it does what it makes a thesis for me? Making a new Facebook? How would you know when you've made a contribution? How will your examiner know if you've made a contribution?
You got a Nobel Prize.
Let's start this. Yeah, well, they might be moving towards some awards. When you submit your thesis, what will make you feel confident that you're going to have a positive outcome? Yeah?
Publications.
Publications, thank you. The fact that your work has been published. So, if you can, you're getting to a content chapter in your thesis. Chapter 4, it might be the first content chapter. And there's maybe study 1. And then you just put like a little asterisk before study 1 and say, oh, by the way, this was published in Chi. Your examiner will be like, that's fine, right? This is a full paper in Chi. It's been, assessed by my peers, or your peers, and they've accepted it, somewhere which is often difficult to get published. And in the major requirement for acceptance is that your peers, so free reviewers, had to say that it was making a novel contribution. So if you can do that along the way of doing your PhD thesis, it will make the job of awarding you a thesis, a PhD, much easier because there's evidence that you have made a novel contribution. Do you see the trick? It's to say, it's not that you're arguing in your thesis that I hope to have made a novel contribution. No, here is the evidence I have done that. My work has been published in a reputable outlet. And that is that's the argument for making a contribution. So you should be aiming to publish during your thesis, because that is a good thing that you can do to move yourself along towards meeting that criteria. And the smaller steps, obviously, there are smaller steps on the way to that. So doing things like this is a good way. You're starting to build a network and getting the feel for what other people are doing. Attending conferences, attending workshops. So the entry, you've got to understand the different types of publications that exist. There's the kind of ones that are considered the kind of like the hard ones, and then there are the ones which are more easier to get. Start with the easier ones and then build your way up. Save your best work for the hard ones, but workshops are a nice entry point. There's often the workshop associated with a conference, and it's going to be on a particular topic, and there you have to write like a 2-page abstract, and that will get you into, and it shows that you're doing some work that's relevant, but it'll allow you an opportunity to talk with your peers, people that are doing similar research to you, and that was already happening this morning. You should talk to you. David is doing a very good job there of pointing out who has commonalities and who has overlaps. And that's important to build these networks. And that's a key point, I'd say, if you're all at this stage of starting out in your research career. Do not underestimate how important social ties are in terms of research community. An area like HCI, the community is really not that big. If you stay in the community, you will see the same people over and over and over again. And you'll actually become friends and make friendships. And it's not just about friendship, it's also on these more professional levels as well. You need to understand where your work sits within a community of other people who are currently doing work in that same area. And in fact, to give you some very concrete advice, I would say that if any of you are saying, well, it's not clear who is doing research in my area now, or I'm very interested in topic X, but all of that work was published in up to 2000 and then it stopped. The good stuff was all done between 96 and 2000. That's when the good stuff was done. But now there doesn't seem to be anyone currently doing it. That is a warning sign. There is a reason why the community stopped doing work in an area, and if there is nobody else doing research in your area, that is often a worrying sign at your stage. You want to know who are the 3 or 4 people in different universities around the world that are also doing work on your topic, and who are the people that you would like to get a job with after you graduate, because that's often the way it works. That you go to conferences, you make connections, you finish your thesis, and then you're looking on the job market, and if you're going to then do a postdoc, that means you're probably going to try and work with that senior professor who you respected for your PhD that didn't suit you. who wasn't your supervisor, that's a good sign for who should be the person you should be approaching to get a postdoc position. And again, it's all about community, having informal connections with people. So in a nutshell, the top kind of down overview is ask a question, gather appropriate data, interpret the data, and make claims that speak to your question. This is kind of like the answers about science being fleshed out. And arguably one approach to doing HCI research, a kind of an empirically focused approach of doing empirical inquiry approach to HCI. So I think we've already heard during your introductions a variety of I'm interested in this. And I would encourage you over the course of this week to really think about what is my primary research question. And David said earlier, you'll be able to say that faster by the end. You should be able to provide that elevator pitch. What is it that I'm really interested in? So here's the depressing thing, is often when you get to, you might think it's depressing, but again, I'm going to argue that it shouldn't be depressing. This is a good thing. The simple reality is that whatever question you're asking, it should have already been asked. And again, I would say it's actually worrying at your stage is if you're existing in too much of a vacuum. You want to be existing in an area which has some foundation to it. So if once you have your question, and you all have questions, I heard them this morning, who has already tackled it? And so when starting a project, you know, the lit review stage, if you like, is basically to find out, well, who's done work like the kind of work I want to do? And when finding that work, here are 3 questions you might want to really focus in on. Not just the blah, blah, blah of the introduction, more references, more citations, but when you actually found a good paper, well, what does it say? What's its main claim? What was the method it used? And what kind of data were gathered? And again, this is very focused on empirical lines of inquiry. But these are the things that I often think about when I find a paper that is in my area and that I respect. These are 3 questions that really should be thinking about when reviewing work. What is it claiming? What method did it use? And what kind of data were gathered? So then you've got 3 roads of attack, right? Or 3 roads for progress. Challenge the claim. Can you make a claim that's different? Consider using a different method, or refine the method. And obviously gather new data. So it provides you ways to kind of develop your research agenda. This is all very high level. So let's come down a level. So I'm going to focus in on one of so just one more helper. So Kai really does focus you on this contribution. So this is the Kai program from a few years ago, and they continue to do it now. You have to write these elevator pitches for each of the papers. It's like 15 words. It's really hard. So next time you write a paper, that 150-word abstract, that's way too long. Try writing it in 15 words. Can you say in 15 words what is new and interesting about your work? So the one paper I'm going to use to kind of take forward an example of how we scoped out a contribution is this one we had at Kai in 2011, Fast or Safe, High Performance, Objectives, Determined Mobility Output, Choices While Interacting on the Move. So this work, so you'll learn a little bit about my research here as well as making it clear how we made this contribution. So this work sits in the space of auto UI, so technology in the car, user interfaces in the car. And this is the Tesla electronic car, so state-of-the-art car with its state-of-the-art iPad next to the steering wheel. So isn't that great? Because iPads are cool, right? So wouldn't you want an iPad in your car? It's the general idea. I think we can agree that that's not a very good idea, right? We know that about HCI to say that's not sensible. But the designers clearly thought it was, and one of the issues here is I think you could focus it on music listening. Most of you, when you drive, you probably enjoy listening to music. It's kind of a common activity. And if you think about the activity of listening to music, there's kind of like the radio, turn it on, and just like somebody gives me something, I just listen to it. Or I can like put a CD in, and just then I've made a choice, but now I have to listen to it when I go. But the trouble is that because we've gotten used to having iTunes on our computer and our entire music repository sitting there and choice, that seem, you know, if we're doing a long car journey, it would be nice to have a bit more choice about what to listen to. So the question then is how to have a suitable design for in the car, given that choice is generally a good thing. So we had a paper a few years back, last year in fact, and it's basically taking the idea of the iPod. Remember the circular wheel they had? Already feels quite dated. So this is a representation of an iPod with a standard iPod-like interface.
Instrument, job, animal, country, fruit, clothing. Dish, color, dish, clothing.
So all it's done is taken the standard input technique of scrolling through a list and made it audio-like. And indeed, that's just thinking about the iPod, but even thinking to the phone, there is...
3G headset includes a screen reader for the visually impaired called VoiceOver. It can speak a description of the item under your finger, so you can easily navigate to various apps and other functions by simply dragging your finger around the screen. You'll hear a click as you move between items. You can also flick left and right with one finger.
So there are examples of commercially available screen readers, basically, audio interfaces. They did say these are for the visually impaired, which I think is kind of there's opportunities to brand that as actually an eyes-free interface. It's an eyes-free interface. It's a very good eyes-free interface with a little bit of practice and training you could use very well. And in the HCI community, there's been interest in multimodal interfaces. The fact that we're too hung up still on this kind of graphical user interface. And the trouble is that when I'm walking down the street or driving my car, wouldn't it be better to interact with this in more of an eyes-free kind of way? So I'm not having to do this and run the risk of kind of being run over by a tram as I cross the street here, or knock somebody over from driving the car. So there's this idea that audio interfaces might allow drivers to keep their eyes on the road while interacting with a device. And amazingly, you take a thing like that, and yes, you don't have to look very far to find good data to support that claim. This was a paper from Auto UI last September, presented back in Eindhoven. And there is a person's interacting with a phone, and they're finding a music song to listen to, and they have a visual-only interface, so looking at the road, looking at the road, looking at the phone, then looking back at the road, so you can see the distribution of eye gaze. And over here we have an audio plus a visual output, looks like I just showed you, and there's a lot less attention going away from the road. The point is this, that we're interested in this topic of driver distraction. How can we make it less dangerous? And what happens when you start on any kind of research topic? Well, that sounds kind of interesting. You don't have to work very hard before you're quickly like, well, it's all been done. And that's probably where many of you are up to now. This is my line of research, but I'm sure you can see a commonality to probably how your research has been advancing as well. You get into a topic, you go, well, that's done, and that's done, and that's done, and that's done. And the thing is then to use all of that to then think about, well, how am I going to make my novel contribution? And our novel contribution in this case was quite small, but it was sufficient. And that was to identify a critical issue. And the critical issue we came to was that for 20 years it's been demonstrated that using an audio interface is less distracting for a task that requires a lot of visual attention. So the idea of having an audio interface in the car is not new. It's been around for years, and it's been in other domains as well, older human factor domains. But the point we kind of came to was to think, well, let's actually look at how easy the task is to perform on these different interfaces, and to the idea that audio interfaces are usually, but not always, but usually slower. So doing a task with an audio interface is usually slower than doing a task with the equivalent GUI. So think of, again, finding your favorite song in your iTunes database. The reason why we tend to use, even on these small screens, a graphical user interface is because our visual system is awesome. And it allows us to very quickly navigate and find stuff. Don't you go to any kind of complex information space and have an audio interface, it's very difficult to navigate. Steve Brewster's done a lot of work up in Glasgow looking at this and trying to explore ways to make it more accessible and make it easier, but it's still difficult because the audio channel is not as good as the visual channel. So our question was, all of this has been a big preamble to our particular question, which is, given a multimodal device, which modality would you choose? So it's a very small contribution. It looks like a very small contribution. It's not like we want to make in-car use safer. We then go, well, get past this. That's been done to some extent. But what we've done then is found a much smaller focus question. So it's all about that you can cut your question at the highest level, and that's inevitably been tackled by a bunch of people for like the last 10 years. But then within there, you should be able to find a more niche, more specific question that you can make yours. And this is the one that we made ours in this paper. And that's basically, the argument I've just given you is what this introduction goes through. So then how did we tackle it? We did an experiment. This is why this is relevant to this course. Experimental HCI, or using empirical methods in HCI research. What we did is develop a lookup task. So the analog might be, well, the analogy would be to this would be like trying to find something in your email. What time does the summer school start this morning? Or which building? Do you all know which building you're coming to this morning? I certainly had to look that up, so I approached on my phone. I had it in my calendar or an email. And what was the address again? So it's a lookup task, right? Occasionally you have to re-find information. And we got people to do questions like that while driving in our simulator. And in doing that, there was two ways of doing that task. One was a traditional graphical user interface in the sense that there was some text, and in the text was the answer. And the other option was a simple speech to text, so this was read out loud. And there were, like, if you like, the two conditions, the audio interface and the visual interface. Why are we using a driving simulator? It's safer, yes. But there are examples. So Barry Brown, up over in Stockholm, does a lot of work sitting behind drivers, watching them do silly things with their phones while driving and writing about it. An ethnographic approach, which is what you're going to hear Geraldine Fitzpatrick's going to talk about that in a couple of days. We could have gone down that route, but we chose not to. Why did we go on the simulator route? Yeah?
And control all kinds of variables.
Yeah, control. Why is control important?
Well, you want the driving difficulty to be pretty much exactly the same for both conditions, so that it doesn't skew your data one way or the other.
What's the word I'm looking for? You're on the right track. What's the one word?
get more data in shorter time?
No.
We'll be able to replicate these.
Replication. So this is like one of the core, again, ideas of the scientific method. The study should be replicable. I should be able to write about it in such a way that you can go and do the same study again and get the same results. In a different place, in a different time. The idea is that what you're getting from this is something that can be reproduced. And that's quite important. And that's very different. This is what kind of makes HCI really fun, right? Is that it's interdisciplinary. And sometimes those disciplines complement, and other times they quite frankly don't get along very well. And the kind of like the ethnographic approach and the scientific approach just clash fundamentally along this line, in the sense that science is all about replication, and the ethnography approach, it's often about studying that instance at that time under that particular condition, right? And what happened then. And I'm not making a value judgment, I'm just saying this is one of the, if you're comparing methods, this is one of the key questions. This is like, the pros and cons of taking a different approach. This is one of the core tensions there. But yes, for our approach here, we go to a simulator because, there's the safety concerns, there's the control, and it's reproducible. So the idea is that every participant can do the same driving situation. Whereas if we did it on a real road, there might be all sorts of different conditions that the driving would happen. And it's outside our control. So let's come to the actual experimental design that was used. And I focus on this paper just because it used an unusual experimental design. It did something a bit different. And what it used was this thing called a no-choice design, which you don't often see in HCI. But I think I'm going to make an argument that it has lots of benefits. A no-choice design has two phases in it, the no-choice phase and the choice phase. The no-choice phase, we make you do a bunch of selections using the audio interface, and we measure performance. And then we make you do a bunch of selections using the audio interface, measure performance. So you practice both of them equally. We know what your performance looks like on both of them. And then once we've got a handle on that, we then say, okay, go crazy. What do you want to do? And then we can figure out what you then choose to do, but also see what your performance looks like and make sense of your choice in relation to what you was like in this no-choice phase. So as you might expect, the results from these two steps are kind of different. So in the no-choice phase, we kind of like do the groundwork, and we show that using an audio interface, they were safer drivers, but they were slower at doing the secondary task. Using the traditional GUI, they had worse driving performance, but they were faster at doing the lookup tasks, as you'd expect. And what we then did in the choice phase was then take our participants. So all participants did both of those. So this is within subjects design. So all participants are doing both this and this. And then when we get to this choice phase, we now have a between subjects manipulation, where half the participants in the study are being told one thing and the other half being told something else, and we're looking at the effect that that manipulation has. And what we told them differently was which task to prioritise. You should prioritise safe driving, you should prioritise finding the information quickly. And then we look to see whether that simple instructional manipulation has any impact on what they choose to do. And it did. So the ones that were told to focus on searching chose the audio interface less frequently because it was slow. Whereas when you were told to focus on driving, you chose it more frequently because it's obvious, right? It's all obvious. But again, it doesn't matter. Again, this is like my particular style of research. I'm never bothered if the result is obvious. Because that's, again, one of the benefits of the scientific approach, is that you're making often obvious points, but you're going through it in a very systematic way, and you're gathering solid data to back up your claim. So what you end up with, or what we ended up with, was a take-home point. And our take-home point was this. Basically something along the lines of audio interfaces are great, but if you need information quickly, then you might sacrifice safety in order to get it quickly and use a more dangerous option. That claim is supported by the data from our study. So the research question, how can we make driving interfaces safer? Well, you could go audio. But we make a claim here that one of the critical issues, thinking about audio interfaces, is these time differences. And if there's a problem there, then people will choose something else on a multimodal device. So that claim is supported by the data from our study. Again, following through on this kind of scientific method. And we end up with a contribution statement, which again is supported, which is basically what I've said. So So, questions you might ask yourself with your own research. Which methodology will you use? So I'm focusing in here on this kind of scientific experimental approach. Throughout this course, you're going to hear different approaches given to you. That's one of the real strengths of HCI research, is that it's interdisciplinary. There's this idea of mixed methods. But within individual research projects, you tend to see a particular research method used. It's less frequent do I see multiple methods used within the same project. What you might get is different researchers working. So I do a lot of work on this topic of multitasking interruptions, and we organised a special interest group at CHI 2012, I think it was, in Austin, where we got people that take experimental approach and take more of a kind of observational ethnographic approach, and got everyone sitting in the room together and talking about the different sets of results that we get from our individual methods. But as individuals, we tend to pursue the research from our own approach, which I think has some strengths. You end up having focus from an individual going deep, but then from a community perspective, you get people doing different things, focusing on the same topic. But I think, so one of the questions for you to think about then is what method will you use in your research, and what are the core trade-offs, or what method would you feel most comfortable using? What will give you the kind of data that you want? And finally, how will these data address your question? To go through, just to touch on, I've been asked to talk about experimental methods. So the great thing about this experimental approach is that it comes straight from experimental psychology often. And you can go away and read the APA, the American Psychological Association publication manual. And they provide, psychology is an old discipline, it's over 100 years old. More than 100, probably 150 years old now. There are rules in place, and guidelines, frameworks. And one of them is method reporting. Participants design materials procedure. If you're doing a human studies experiment, this is what you'd expect to be there. And the same is true for HCI research. So whenever I read a HCI paper that tends to report an experiment, these are the 4 things that I expect to see in the method section. Participants. If you're going to do a study, who will you get to do it? Will it be the people in the office next door to you? Will it be you? Can you be your own participant in your own study? Psychophysics, that's fine. The psychophysics experiments in psychology usually have 3 participants, and they're the 3 authors of the paper. But they're testing stuff that they can't lie about, so it's not a problem. In HCI, this is more of a problem. Studies at Microsoft tend to go outside of their local pool and pay people to come in from outside so they don't get predominantly males under 30. So there is a selection bias, right? And it's funny to see, then you see that shifting around depending on which department it's based in, right? How the makeup of students changes. Or do you want to use students at all? Do you want to use older adults? Do you want to use younger children? Do you want to use, so who are you going to use? How many of them will you need? This special criteria business. And ethics is one of the, if you're interacting with people, there will be a code of ethics that you should be operating under. Jetty is going to speak more specifically about ethics. So I won't cover it in depth here. I will come back to it though in a moment, in the context of some recent HI research. But again, the APA publication manual, the APA and the British Psychological Association, all these kind of umbrella psychology associations have very clear guidance on what we should do. For the design, I mean, I've already touched on this when talking through my example research. Two most important words, independent variable and dependent variable. Independent variable, a thing that you manipulate. Dependent variable, a thing that you measure. So, going back to my study in the no choice phase, what is the independent variable? The modality of the interface. Is it the audio interface or is it the visual interface? It's a thing that I, as an experimenter, have manipulated. You come to my study, I give you a device, and I say you're going to use it in this way or you're going to use it in that way. It's a thing I'm experimentally controlling, so it's an independent variable. The dependent variable. There are two. What are they?
Line keeping and target function.
Yeah, so it's their performance measures in this case. And the driving performance measure is lane keeping, and for the search task, it's time to find the target. So an RT, reaction time type measure. And they are things that I'm measuring, or my software is measuring. A trial starts, a timer is started, data is gathered, and it's stopped. And there's a whole bunch of skills required there for handling data. That would take a long time. These are the kind of details of doing research. I'm more than happy to share input there. Eye tracking is particularly fun as well. It gives you lots of data. So let's focus in on those independent variables, so the things that you're manipulating. And I mentioned this again, but I'm just going to say it again for good measure. A big choice here is when you're designing an experiment is whether it's within subjects or between subjects. Within subjects means that the same person does both or all conditions. So repeated measures. Between subjects means that one person does one thing and another person does another, so they're independent. So there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a trade-off. And benefits, you need fewer people, because if everyone's doing the same thing, you have fewer of them, right? You don't need as many people. Whereas between subjects, if you have two conditions, suddenly you've doubled the number of people you need. So you've gone from having 10 to 20. And that becomes more as you make the design more complicated. Another benefit to within subjects, because you've got fewer people, there's less noise. So the idea that, individuals are different, right? Your errors are slightly faster than, some tasks, and you're probably faster at some tasks versus CNST. I'm sorry, but by doing within subjects, you reduce that because the same person's doing everything, so you're comparing them to themselves. Whereas between subjects, you're comparing two different people, and there's going to be some individual difference going on there. But the downside of within subjects is that people get tired, and because they've done one thing, they now know what's coming later on, and that might influence them. So you get this kind of idea of contamination across conditions. And so that's often a reason why the team subject is used. If it's single shot, you know, I want to get your reaction. So the choice thing, when we've got to that choice phase, do you want to choose this or this, and this is your priority? That wouldn't have worked as a within subject's character, right? Can you see that? If I first say, now focus on this, now focus on that, you'd be like, I figured out what you're doing here. It would be polluted. So that's why I went between subjects. There's lots of textbooks you can read over this kind of stuff. I'm going to come back to this in the stats part later on this afternoon, but the actual experimental design as well, is it a single factor, so you're manipulating just one independent variable? Or you now got several independent variables all being manipulated at the same time? I'm going to come back to that. Materials. What is the task that you had participants do? So in our case, it was making the... So when I came to write the materials section for that paper, I'm describing the driving simulator. I'm describing the task that the person did while driving so that it can be reproduced. I'm describing the way they did the lookup task and describing the audio interface, describing the visual interface. So how the task is being performed. And a procedure is then simply the protocol for running each participant through the study. So what happened on the day? How you interacted with them. So a little summary. The purpose, I guess, of these experimental approaches is to gather data to address a question. Variables, independent and dependent. And choice of experimental design, single factor or factorial. How are we doing for time? No. How are you guys doing for time? I see some people get there.
But we can do a break if this is a good break.
How do we feel? Do we want to get some lunch and come back to this after lunch and then have a good activity?
I think they might be.
Who would be upset if we said, that's it, we'll just No one upset?
This is kind of a cliffhanger.
Good, there we go. I'll leave you with the lurking problem to think about. You might think about what it might be during lunch. So the lurking problem. So to go back to my use of cartoons, you know, we're liking science. There's also Reviewer 2 jokes out there on Facebook and in general around the scientific community. Don't be tricked. Reviewer 2 can sometimes masquerade themselves as Reviewer 3 or Reviewer 1. But either way, it's that pesky reviewer that wants to see your work rejected. And I'm making light of a kind of a serious thing here. Just to give a little bit of context, so to make it very clear, the usual, I mentioned about publishing before, and about different types of outlets. How does work get published? It gets reviewed by your peers. So, have any of you been asked to review work yet?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, yeah. So a few of you have, good. So that's where people will send you, an editor will send you a manuscript and ask for your opinion on it. The thing that I find fascinating about peer review is that rarely are people taught how to do it. Hence, I think where a lot of this Reviewer 2 must die kind of comes from, or how to defeat reviewers, because people across science aren't explicitly taught how to write a good review. And what does reviewing mean? But that's probably a whole other topic of discussion. But if you're interested in reviewing, the process of reviewing, writing a review, we can certainly talk about that over coffee if you want to. So come talk to that reviewing. I review an awful lot of work now, and there is ways of doing it nicely, so you're not that evil reviewer, but it's probably helpful. But reviewers do say things. So in our case, Reviewer 2 is hiding as Reviewer 3. So this is the reviews from that paper that I showed you, the Kai 2011 paper. And reviewer 3 says, despite the excellent quality of experimental techniques and analysis, the paper does not reach its intended goal because of the absent ecological validity in the experimental design and a few critical and justified assumptions behind it. So, I mean, I'm pulling on one aspect of their review. Overall, the reviews are very favourable and positive, and it's part of the process. But I pull on this because this is one of these things that comes up quite often around experimental work within the HCI community in particular. This issue of ecological validity, or the concern of ecological validity. So I want to speak about that for a moment. The core tension with this reviewer is getting at, and it's something that kind of you can see across my talk earlier this morning, is this tension between lab and the real world. And I've already hinted at this. This kind of tension is a big one in the HCI community. We're multidisciplinary. We have people that have been trained to do experiments, and we've got people that have been trained to do observational research. And the two kind of collide with different sets of values for evaluating research, and they bring different things to the table. So as I said earlier on, we used a driving simulator because it is precisely more like the laboratory. It's controlled, you can replicate it. But there is still then the case of what happens in this artificial setting. How does it relate to the outside context that we're speaking of? And then there's other types of research, which is more this kind of observational, situated, looking at people interacting with technology in the moment, in a rich context. It's less easy to replicate, it's less controlled, but it's got this rich context wrapped up around it. And this is a real tension when you get to, so at CHI there is the Understanding People subcommittee that I kind of exist in, and this is one of these topics that kind of you see around that table and in the submissions that come in. So, to come back to the lab work, so there's a book recently been published by Stephen Payne and Andrew Howells just last year, one of these lectures on human-centered informatics, on adaptive interaction. And towards the end of that book, there's a discussion on the experimental approach in HCI, or experimental methods in HCI. And they pull out that experiments are designed to test causal hypotheses about the interrelationships of variables. And again, this comes firmly back to this idea of the experimental method, scientific method, that you're manipulating an independent variable, condition A, condition B, to then see what effect that manipulation has, if any, on the dependent variable that you're measuring. So that's what experiments are usually done. They're designed, purposely designed, to test this kind of cause and effect. That the changing in one thing leads to a change in another thing, or an outcome on the other end, an independent variable. So in our case, we saw that having either an audio interface or a visual interface led to a change in drive performance and task time. Now, then we come to this issue of ecological validity. And it's a phrase that's used a lot, but often incorrectly. So ecological validity is an approach. So you can read at people like Brunswick, for instance. And it's an experimental approach that attempts to represent or be representative of real-world tasks by sampling across those tasks and contexts. So the idea is that by taking an ecological approach to your research, if you're interested in, let's go back to the example of supporting a music. We want to design a new interface to find songs, to play music while driving. So if I were to build a radically new interface, in order to then do an ecological evaluation of that, I would want to take care in making sure I understood what type of music people like to listen to, how many songs are usually on their device, how often they change songs. So these are things about the natural context, and I could learn from observational work or from other kinds of work that kind of would get statistics for this kind of stuff that would then inform my experiments. An even better example comes from on your phone. When you go to write an email or a text message, you have to work with that awful keyboard, right? So there's a really active branch of HCI on improving keyboard design. I'm going to talk about that later on with the example I'm going to give you, the activity. And what you see there is that, imagine we want to redesign the keyboard. People have done that. But what did they do? They looked at the input language and the characteristics of it. So what words are entered. And it's great because let's just keep to the English language, but there are documents you can go to that say what's the frequency of which words will be lettered. So from there you can then figure out how likely it is you're going to go from this character to this character. That's an ecological approach. You're understanding the environment, and then you're bringing aspects of the environment into your lab study to then see your experiment is then motivated by the ecology of the environment. So this is what we mean by sampling across tasks and materials and their contexts. External validity is what often people mean when they say ecological validity. External validity is all about generalization. I did this study in this context. What does it say about another context? How can I generalize one to the other? And that's an issue for experiments, but arguably it's also an issue for more observational work as well. If you observe some way that I'm using my phone here, how similar is it going to be the way that somebody would use a phone somewhere else, in another country, or another context, another part of the city? How does context drive things? And that's one about generalization between contexts. So now what I wanted to do is just to touch on 4 current themes that I see in the community. In the wild, replication, interaction science, and big data. So in the wild is really, it's something that really is taking over in HCI. A lot of funding calls advocate doing in the wild research, and more publications are advocating taking an in the wild approach. So not doing research in the lab, but out there in the real world. So I'm going to talk through an example of some recent work we had at CHI this year, where we did an in the wild study, if you like. And this is called Interrupted by a Phone Call with some colleagues at DFKI in Germany. And this work focuses on phone. And I don't know if you've had this experience when you use your phone, but you'll be writing an email, tap, 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 tap. And then just in the middle of a sentence, this happens, something calls. But you have that feeling? And that's, you have no choice. Like, why are you calling me? And you have to do something with it. And here it's like I've got no idea who's calling me. So I have to decide to either accept or decline. I can't just politely ignore it. And this is different to, say, how Skype or text messages work, where you get a small notification top, but you can still kind of carry on your primary activity. So we thought this was a bad design. So, there's some arguments at the beginning of the paper as well about how there's not been any change. Like, you remember when phones used to look like this? This is still the same model. So there's been very little evolution of the interaction design model. And so what we did is to explore that space. And so here are some design alternatives. This is like the equivalent of when a text message comes in. You get a little alert at the top, but you can still carry on with your main activity. And then here we've added a third option, which is postpone. This doesn't matter really. We did a lab study to explore this. This is very traditional, 3 interfaces, do a study, have an ecologically informed experiment with sampling across tasks, sampling across activities, getting people to do stuff, calls come in during that activity, you have to handle it, and then we look at performance, all very controlled, all very nice. Right, and we get some results from that, that was nice. But we wanted to learn about how that could be taken forward to a broader context and a more wild context, naturalistic. So the way that we took this forward in a follow-up study after the lab study, so taking it out of the lab and into a more of a naturalistic context, was to release it. Right? So the app was made, it was stuck up on the Google Play Store, and you could go and download it for free. And it provided a new, once you installed this app and had it running, you handled calls in a different way. The way that this worked was, let's assume you're playing Angry Birds, not a big stretch there, I'm sure. And as you're about to flick this bird, this time, it's an important flick, when you're on the highest level you've ever got to, and somebody calls you, Mr. Callhead calls you, and you get the alert that somebody's calling you coming in, and you can just stay there, and you can carry on playing. But if you decide, actually, I do want to speak to this person, you grab that icon, and then you drag it to the accept location. Or you can put it down to the postpone, or you can drag it down to the ignore. And you can also change where Mr. Callhead appears, so you can change his default position. This is all in the app. And now, it was released last year, a year ago, last July, and a bunch of people went and installed it in a short period of time. And what we then did was have a second version of the app, which you could then install, you could choose to install. So we gave you that for free, and said, okay, now you can be good citizens and contribute to basic research by installing another one that will harvest your data. So informed consent. Come back to that in a moment. You might be aware of some publicity that was around that topic. But this was a version of where there was informed consent. You had to then install a second version. We might now understand why Facebook did what they did, because amazingly when you have to do that, you get a very small number of people signing up for the second study, compared to the number that were getting the app for free. But then what we were able to do is, once we had that data, we were then able to listen, essentially, to people. So these 652 users using the app, and we were listening to how they're using the app, how many times they were receiving calls during concurrent usage, all that kind of stuff. And you get some data that kind of looks like this, usage data, usage log data. So by releasing this application to a market, people are using it, and then you're simply listening to what they're doing with it. And we can then use this data to then give us data to answer the questions that we had at the beginning, which is about how people handle calls and about whether our app is making a difference. So what we see from here is that like a third of incoming calls interrupt concurrent app usage. That is, I'm doing something on my phone and somebody calls me. So 30% of incoming calls happen while you've got your phone out twiddling with it. So they're interrupting you. So that's good. And Matthias Talwalker has published quite a few papers now advocating this point, that phone calls are an interruption to concurrent other app usage. But then also we got some idea of breaking down how those interrupting calls are treated. So 56% of them are accepted. But the interesting cases are these two ones, where it's either an active decline or a passive decline, where the active decline is sliding it to the red thing and saying, I want to talk to you now, which is what you could do before. So that is the person's calling you and I'm making an active choice to make the phone call go away. But this bigger case, 36%, is where you just let it ring through, essentially. And many of us probably do this already when somebody calls you, because you don't want to say decline, because then it goes through the voicemail too quickly, which suggests to the person who's trying to call you, you are there, you just don't want to speak right now. But instead you just go, put it to the side and let it, then eventually it will stop ringing and then you go and pack your phone back. But this design allows you to do that while still playing Angry Birds. So you can still carry on doing what you're doing. You don't have to wait for the screen blanked out when you ran through for 30 seconds. So we get an idea about how this app will be used in a broad market. I understand now that a new version of the Android operating system is going to look something like this as well, so we're quite happy about that. because research actually gets taken up and then fed through into new releases, which is nice. So that's an example of what we might say an in the wild approach, in the sense that we're losing experimental control. We did a lab study, we learned some stuff, but the things that we are learning there is necessarily limited because we're controlling so much of the lab context, we are missing out on how and why and whether people are actually going to really use this. So that's the motivation for going in the wild, is that you release stuff and then you can see how it actually takes off. But I would say that just because something is done in the wild, it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand that context. You don't necessarily understand the context in which that activity is taking place. So this is what you see a lot in log data analysis, that you've no idea what those logs really mean, what people were really doing, why they did what they did. You have nothing else than the logs themselves. And can you replicate it? So going even more into the wild, so I'd say, one of these, this is a fun study from one of my colleagues at UCLIC. Yvonne Rogers has a Tidy Street project, and I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's lots of fun really. So she was interested, this project was interested in home energy usage, so how much electricity and gas you're using to run your home. And obviously there's lots of incentives to decrease that value. And rather than going down a smart meter approach, they went around this idea of community action. So what they did is they got this street and some people on the street to be involved, and what they did is use this spray chalk to spray on. They sampled the people that lived in the place, they gave them their electric meter readings every day, and they gathered them all up, calculated the average for the street, and then sprayed that onto the street, and you could see how much energy the street as a whole was using. And then compared to the average of the city that they lived in, which you can see this is a very, very conscientious street. They're using way below the average of the city. And the idea being here that, again, this is in the wild because it's occurring in a natural context. It's kind of more like an installation art piece. You know, it's trying out different ways of representing data and kind of getting community buy-in, this kind of lo-fi technology approach. But it doesn't replicate very well. We heard about a version, this was tried out in a Canadian city, and it didn't work. Probably because it's probably in a city where people were mainly in their car, and by the time you probably drove over the street graffiti without even realizing what it was. Whereas here, this is close to the town centre, and you can go and explore and be on foot. So the idea it worked in this context, but how well does it generalise to other contexts? How replicable is it? So as you can see, I'm beating this drum about replication quite a lot. I'm not the only one. We're in the Kai community, we see the Replikai Awards were given out in 2013. There seems to be a fairly regular workshop taking place at Kai on replication in the HI community. And I see this as a natural response to one of the main criteria for getting a paper accepted at this conference is to make a novel contribution. So novelty often entails not doing what somebody did before. So I think that's one of these tensions. And I see this replication Kai as kind of being a bit of a back against that, saying, we do recognise that there is value in replicating and extending previously published research results, so that we get this idea of advancing the field and building the science base in this area. Also, Kai, this year we saw an interaction science spotlight, which is highlighting the value of this kind of the work that takes a scientific approach to the HI community. Again, I'm just pointing you to these resources so you can go and explore them at your own time. But it's seen as like a spotlight area where people are quite motivated to bring up the profile of this. But of course, this is kind of in many ways just a return to the beginning of HCI. So arguably HCI started with this book by Cardman and Newell, and this was basically taking this kind of replication, interaction science approach, where building on psychological knowledge and theory to basically build up engineering-like approximations about how people interact with technology to predict how long tasks take. The internet has given us new opportunities, though, for doing research that we couldn't do before. So the Mechanical Turk has been quite revolutionary in many ways. So when I talked to you before about recruiting your participants, most of the time that was like, how am I going to get 20? I've got 4 master's students back in London at the moment, and they're like, how many participants do I have to get? And how do I get them? And of course, we've got a class of 30 people, and they're all trying to do a study in the next 2 weeks. So there's lots of like, I'll do your study on mine. Each study takes an hour, and there's some goodwill will go far, but it's difficult, right? So anyone who's run a study probably realizes it's often quite difficult to persuade people to come to your lab and spend an hour of their time sitting doing the task that you ask them to do. It's obviously coming to the lab is one of the you can pay them a little bit, and that often helps. But it's often quite difficult. And the way around that difficulty is to pay more money, but then your costs go up. Mechanical Turk has been seen as one way of getting around this trouble, which is that we spend a lot of time sitting at computers. You can run a study, we could run a study by the end of the day, get 20 people to do a study, and it would cost us about £5 or €5. And we would get participants from somewhere out there in the internet, and they would do it for some nominal paycheck. And it's a bit disturbing, but it's seen as like a new platform, if you like, for running certain types of study. There is a community, a growing community around this topic, HCOM. It's going to be in Pittsburgh in November. And a lot of people thinking about what will the future of work look like. But also, not just the future of work when it's devolved across internet platforms, but also what's the implications for running certain types of studies as well. So we currently have a paper that we just submitted on studying interruptions on these platforms, so when people interrupt themselves. Of course, industry's been doing this for a long time now, right? A/B testing is something that usability people talk about and understand a lot. The idea that if you don't know where to put an advert on a page, then try out different places with different subsets of users and see which one is most effective. So A/B testing is simply the scientific method. You have the independent variable, which is the layout of the page or the placement of the thing on the page, or which color of blue to use in the Google search results. And the dependent variable, which you're measuring, is, if you're Amazon, it's simply what's your conversion rate, how many things are you selling? And all you're doing there is some kind of optimization, local optimization hill climbing, where you're just trying to figure out what works best, which design works best for maximizing your DV, dependent variable you're measuring. So this is basically all that I talked about this morning, about classic experimental approaches. That's kind of what A/B testing is. You've got alternatives, they are your independent variable, but you need to figure out something you care about, your dependent variable. What's the thing that you're measuring? And then simply put it out there to the world and see which one wins, where you're taking some control to filter out which one goes to which person. We get people going a bit further than that, though. So you get big data is a topic or a word that's used an awful lot at the moment. And this book that I wrote back in October, which is quite a fun read. And one of the big claims in this book, it's a really accessible book, and I recommend having a flick through it, is that they argue that a lot of our approaches to doing scientific research around getting a sample, getting 20 participants to come to your lab and do a study, and then doing statistics on their data, that comes from an era when data was difficult to gather. So getting 20 people to come to your lab is difficult. And the argument being that now that we've got phones just listening to everything that I do and sending back the data to whichever server is listening to it, there is now lots and lots of data And so because now data is easier to gather, different approaches are going to be taken to analysing that data to make different types of statistics are therefore going to be used. Of course, there is a lot of uncomfort in the community around this whole big data discussion. So Becky Grintner at Georgia Tech wrote a nice little magazine article in the Interactions magazine last year talking about, I guess, 3 or 4 major concerns there. The one that I find most interesting is this idea that you can't do this. You can't run easily a big data study because you're not Microsoft or Google or Facebook, unless you're an employee of those organizations. So now you've been shut out, right? You as a researcher, you can't replicate what they've done. So my PhD work was on information search, and I did little lab studies and eye tracking, and I remember being blown away by this work that some people at Microsoft Research did, looking at how people were re-querying Bing, essentially, when doing searches. And they had data from 150,000 participants. Like, I can't do that. I don't have the power or the reach to kind of get that data. So they're now in a special, privileged place. And I think that's quite a... It is something to make us concerned, I think, as scientists. The idea that I can't do what you're doing because I don't work. And these organisations who gather this data are the only ones that can do that research unless they give their data away for free. And then, of course, we had this happen last month, right? The world went crazy over this Facebook study. And another study about it sparks soul-searching and ethical questions. So, what are those ethical? Do you remember this study? I mean, I don't have to even mention all of that, do I? The idea that they were meant to be changing people's emotions by sending different news stories. And the big concern was one about informed consent. And so when it comes to ethics, Jenny's going to talk more about ethics tomorrow, or Monday, aren't you? Monday. So the APA, for instance, have ethical principles and codes of conduct. And you can look through this kind of material. One of the big ones is that if I take part in your research, I'm giving informed consent. I understand that I'm taking part in the research there. And the point is in this thing like the Facebook thing is that they didn't understand what they were doing. I quite like this article. If you're interested in this debate, get away from the news sites. So Michael Bernstein at Stanford Computer Science, he wrote a nice thing saying, but why is the people that are commenting this not from our area of research? So he was really shocked to find out that like everyone on the street corner had an opinion on this Facebook story and was out there advocating, telling a story about it, what their opinion was. Most of them didn't do social computing research. They did research in some other discipline that had something to do, roughly, with computers, but not really. The people that were primarily doing this type of research were remaining quite silent on the issue. And then Michael spoke up and wrote this nice little opinion piece on it, which his Facebook page is now exploded with lots of all the community giving comments on it. One of the things, so that was one of the things to talk about. Why are you probably can't read this? Why are others running the Facebook's ethic discussion for us? So his concern there is that by other people getting famous by giving their opinion on this topic, the right people then aren't going to be invited back to speak to government and the legislators in the future, which is a particular concern. And then there's a note on why hammering on offline ethics onto online experiments is misguided. So his point there is that a lot of what seemed to be happening here with this whole story is that you basically had a bunch of people that are used to doing experiments in the lab going, well, why didn't they have to do the paperwork I had to do? And so if you do an online, if you do a traditional experiment, particularly in the US context, the paperwork to run an experiment is heavy, very heavy, and it has to go through a formal panel process. And you could see yourself as a researcher getting frustrated. And you see these guys is doing nothing and getting away with it, right? And, but the question is, what is an appropriate? Is this the appropriate ethics standards to be applied to these kind of in the wild, big data-ish studies? Or is there some other middle ground needed? And again, I don't have any answers for this, it's just issues to think about. And it's particularly relevant if you're going to launch a system like we did with our redesign of the call handling. We chose not to just listen to the data from 10,000, but to get data from just 500 who gave explicit consent. Was that the right way of doing it? It feels that we got the moral high ground, but maybe we should have just listened to the 10,000. I'm not advocating a position here, I'm just saying these are things that are currently being discussed in the community right now, because people don't have a good opinion on this. Well, they do have an opinion, there's lots of opinions on it. It's not clear what the way forward is. Eric Gilbert of Georgia Tech is another person to listen to on this. He has a lot of strong opinions on this topic. In terms of other books you can look at, David asked for a list of materials. So Research Methods for Human-Computer Interaction by Paul Kearns, Anna Cox is definitely worth a read through. It's kind of condensing a lot of what I've said today and putting it into one book. And Frank Ritter at Penn State has got this book, Running Behavioral Studies with Human Participants, a very practical guide, which is also a fun read. Going back to what a PhD is, how you know you're done, things that your supervisor probably didn't tell you, but you have to figure out as you go along. This is, again, just a very accessible book. Pick it up for like 10 euros from Amazon and read it on a train journey one day, and you'll find it's light-hearted, it's fun, but it's got a lot of truths in it. And I pulled out the main ones. Finish your PhD quickly, get to know the community, get known for something, try to become famous for something in particular, your area, your contribution. Teaching is a learned part. Making sure you have time for research. That's what we're going on to the next step. There's my contact details, but I think you can know contact otherwise. Let's activities. So let's get you. That's me talking now. A little over half an hour. So I want you to do something now. Get you to think. So I've already mentioned this. Text entry. It sucks. It's horrible. This is why I still carry my laptop around with me. I can do a lot of stuff on my phone, but I can't do all of my email on my phone because it's just too painful. So text entry is an active area of HI research. And there have been some quite novel inventions that come out of the HI community. One of them being ShapeWriter, which some of you may have on your phone. Does anyone have this? Where instead of tapping, you draw. Does anyone have this yet? Good. So you can do this. So instead of going tick, 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 you simply trace your finger through the letters, and then it gives you an autocomplete suggestion. You choose that one. So here is the system. So here, you see a bit better, right? So instead of going F-U-N, I simply trace, and then it figures out from the letters that I've swiped through, what word I could possibly be entering, and then I have the option to then click up there. So it's different to tapping. The authors claim, almost 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, claim that experienced users can write many times faster on ShapeWriter than a conventional touch keyboard. So what I want you to do is think about how you would design an experiment to investigate this claim. Because remember, experiments in HCI, they tend to gather data that make claims to answer a question. Our question here is, how can I get people to write faster? Here is a design alternative. There's a claim that we want to make to say this is better than a traditional tap, tap, tap approach. How would you do it? So do you want to take a few minutes? So what do we do? So I think we should spend 5 minutes as individuals, or do you want to get into groups now? No, take 2 minutes as an individual to write down notes. And then after 2 minutes, I'm going to pull you into little groups. Because you've been sitting and listening for far too long. You need to kind of move around. So that's what we'll do. Think for 2 minutes, write down some notes, and then I'll form you into small groups. And you can discuss amongst your group. And then I want to eventually get you to tell us what the answer is. Good.